Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting Center for Education Neuroscience seminar. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Julie Dockrell. Dr. Julie is a professor of psychology and special needs at the UCL Institute of Education. She is also a clinical and educational psychologist. Her research mainly focuses on the patterns of language development and the ways in which oral language development skills impact children's learning and interaction and attainments. She also addresses inequalities in early language development and communication. Dr. Julie also uses evidence-based research to support children's learning through interventions, enhanced language learning environments, as well as professional development. She was also the deputy chair of the British Psychological Society Research Board, and she served as treasurer and chair of the BPS Developmental Psychology section. This year, she was awarded the Outstanding Contribution to Developmental Psychology. Today, Julia will be talking to us about the importance of understanding the development of oral language and the role of implementation science. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and I will go through them right after the talk. Now I will hand over to you, Julia.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. I hope I can live up to it, so we'll see how we go. And thank you for being here in your comfortable homes. Right, so I'm going to look at oral language, and I've got a plan of about 5 things I'm going to do. So I'm going to try and outline for you what the importance of oracy skills are for children's learning and development. I'm going to look a little bit at teachers' engagement with the construct of oracy, and then stand back a bit and say, well, what are the components of oral language at school entry? What should we be thinking about? I'm going to report some data that we collected pre-lockdown about the oral language skills of children in areas of social disadvantage, significant social disadvantage. And finally, I'm going to talk about the results of an RCT that we've just completed, where looking at implementation in settings of social disadvantage, and then to talk a little bit about the next rollout, which is being run by the Education Endowment, funded rather by the Education Endowment Foundation. Okay, so why did I use the term implementation? Okay, so I think impactful work research is underpinned by understanding the complexity of development in an evidence-informed way. Development, I think whatever we look at, is a very nuanced and complex issue. Then we need to think about embedding what we know and learn in an implementation science framework to take things forward. And the first step in this activity is establishing relationships between the core constructs. So here I'm thinking about oral language and learning, and then a little bit about what teachers know, because establishing relationships also mean looking at what's happening in education context. So in terms of oral language, I'm going to work through some of the issues about what I'm going to argue are relevant to real world relevance. The first thing is looking at what you do before the intervention. So you establish whether there are a relationship between some of these factors, to look at efficacy studies. Could the program actually work? And then talk a little bit about effectiveness studies, and then finally implementation studies. What makes the program work in practice settings, or what makes it not work? So I'm briefly going to try and go through these first 3 stages. So let's look at this issue about, is there a relationship? So why is oral language important? Why have I spent the last 40-odd years looking at oral language? Well, I want to argue that oral language underpins a whole range of skills. It encourages the development of cognitive skills. It promotes social and emotional regulation. It impacts on reading comprehension and writing. It's essential for learning in school and accessing the curriculum. And actually, long-term language and communication skills result in limited access to jobs and training. And one of the things employers at the moment complain about is that the young people in the workplace struggle with communicating in those settings. And this is a quote, which I think is a very important quote in thinking about things. A child's language skills more strongly predict 3rd grade reading comprehension then parent income, ethnicity, and level of, which we can't see, and I can't remember at the bottom of that. Education. Okay. So oral language skills are really important. And some of you may say, well, yeah, of course, you can see why they're relevant to reading. So I'm going to take a slightly different example. Some work I've been doing with a colleague over a number of years about children's writing. And I'm going to look at how oral language impacts on writing development. So this is a large-scale set of data that we collected with 90 children in primary schools. These are mainstream children. They do not have any difficulty, so they're typically developing. And we took measures of a range of variables which people have shown impact on the way children produce written text. So that's nonverbal ability, their reading skills, their spelling skills, their ability to handwrite quickly, and what I'm going to call is a writing process measure. So we all write in bursts and pauses. We put a few words together and then we stop to think about the next word. So we had a writing process measure, which is important certainly in planning. And then we included measures of receptive and expressive vocabulary, because at this point, people really hadn't looked at how oral language impacted on children's writing skills. We measured writing in 3 ways. We measured quality, productivity, and holistic quality, grammatical accuracy, and lexical diversity. And for the argument here, I'm just going to show you the added variance in explaining these 3 different dimensions of writing. And for those of you who aren't writing researchers, let me just say that actually assessing children's writing is very difficult. There's no standardized ways of assessing children's writing under the age of 8, and those between age 8 and 10 are quite unreliable, which is one of the reasons government has changed the way it assesses writing and introduced a grammar and spelling test, which seemed easier. So in terms of this regressions, I'm just going to go through them, adding in, starting with chronological age, and then looking at oral language, reading, spelling, handwriting. And the basic answer to this is that in all of these 3 measures of writing quality, oral language as a unitary combined receptive and expressive measures contributes about 25% of the variance. A little bit more in holistic quality, a little bit less, but overall, oral language is important. And really, it doesn't matter which way you put these in the regression model. I'm just done it in terms of that, take that forward. All right. So if oral language matters to children's writing, what do teachers know about oral language? You know, how do they embed that in the practice working with children? So remember, these are children who are typically developing. They're pretty much from areas of social, not disadvantage, but not advantage. It matters. So the key, I think, for this first stage, when we look at how we go on and develop evidence-based practice, is looking at the relationship between teaching and learning. So here I'm going to ask them very simple, I'm going to show some very simple data that we've collected, looking at how teachers think and what kind of opportunities they've had to learn about oral language. So we know that they face challenges in relation to oracy, and this is going to be moved because I can't actually move this slightly on the screen. Okay. Right. And we looked at the teachers' understanding. So this is about 200 teachers, representative, looking at across the primary. They're all primary school teachers, and what were their views about their training? Well, no, it's not going.
Yeah, take back on the.
Yeah, I have to go back, I think. Yeah.
Take back on the graph.
Hello?
Okay, here we go. So about 60% said they were lacking training in terms, or had insufficient training. Can't see the bottom there, actually. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Thank you. About half of them were having 40% having difficulties in identifying children who struggle with writing, and 50% had challenges in providing support for children with oral language, or providing general support for developing oral language. Okay, we then looked at children, we looked at disadvantaged nursery settings. So we know there's an association between areas of social disadvantage and children's poor oral language. Now, I am not saying that social disadvantage causes oral language difficulties. That is not what I'm saying. There is an association, and that's important to unpick that. But we kind of hoped that in these areas that staff would have more training, more experience, be able to engage with the young children in those settings. And what we found that about 44% of them had some training in the last 5 years. Well, that's quite good that they'd had some training. However, most of the training that was available to them were very short amounts of training, few hours. So insufficient, I would argue, to develop, support them in developing interventions for children. Okay. We tried to use data from the Millennium Cohort Study to think about, well, if teachers have these challenges with oral language, how good are they at picking up children who have language difficulties? So a different type of data set. And we examined identification of speech and language needs, which is how it was described in the Millennium Cohort Study, for children at the ages of 7 and 11. And we tried to look at what the predictors were of teachers picking up these problems. So we had children's language at 3 and 5, which predicted teachers' identifications of problems. And we had parent report and vocabulary. Those were the most powerful predictors of teacher identification of language learning needs at 7 and 11. The prevalence rates that we found at 7 were similar to smaller clinical studies. Okay, so about 25% of the children were being picked up with having some kind of problems. 1 in 5, 20%. By the age of 11, it had significantly reduced. Teachers were not picking up or not identifying or not saying that there were language problems. This reduction is not found in clinical studies. Well, why do we get this disjuncture? What's going on here in terms of what's happening? Maybe children's language challenges are less evident in educational settings. We actually don't have very good, reliable, and valid measures to benchmark children's language development. So the question is, you know, do we know what children should be doing, or young people should be doing in terms of developing their language skills? I mean, we know what employers say they're not doing, but what is it that's critical? Within education, what we find is this really big focus on vocabulary and the word gap, and that's problematic as children develop, because you can, you know, while you can pick up children's vocabulary might be limited at 4, it's much harder to think about what that might be at 9, 10, or 11, unless you're looking at specific areas. And teachers were generally less confident about what constitutes oracy skills in comparison to literacy skills. So that made us stand back and think, okay, well, what actually should we be measuring? If we want to embed an intervention and we want to support teachers in doing it, what aspects of oral language should we be looking at the end of nursery and into entry into primary school? So we finished the project, first stage of the project, where we looked at oracy skills as children enter school. And what we aimed to do was capture the dimensions of oral language between the ages of 4 and 6. We assessed over 200 monolingual children. We used a broad range of language measures, tapping both comprehension and production. And I say there, we've followed them over 2 years. Well, there was COVID in between, so we sort of followed them, but we're picking them up at the end now. But these are our data that reflect the baseline measures that we got. So these children between the ages of 4 and 6. Now, before I tell you what we found, I'd like you as experts in developmental psychology to think about, what do you think we should have found? Was oral language made up of dimensions around phonology, pragmatics, and semantics, or morphology, vocabulary, and syntax? You know, so have your own hypothesis about what we found, and I'll tell you what we found. Okay, so we found a 3-factor solution. And these three factors reflected phonology, structural language, which is vocabulary and grammar, and then our dimension of narrative skills. Now, I think narrative skills is really important because we don't tend to look at that. People go in and measure vocabulary. They talk about that as oral language, but narrative skills, both in terms of producing a narrative and understanding a narrative, were key. Now, what we have in the UK has been a long-standing focus on the phonics, followed up by a bit of vocabulary when the word gap became, I'm going to say trendy, but yeah. One of my PhD students, Keely, went and did a systematic review to look at the importance of narrative skills on early language, and she highlighted the importance of narrative for extended and connected discourse, for communication purposes, and moving from what I'm going to call context-dependent oral communication to context-independent communication. So, why is this important? What does that mean about what we should be doing about oral language interventions? Well, we need to target structural language. That's probably not rocket science in terms of vocabulary and grammar, but we also need to think about narrative skills, but we need to think about it within the context of what our practitioners understand and are able to implement in the settings that they're working. So we need to demonstrate an awareness of teachers' needs. So there's a kind of a knowledge exchange between both of us. So as far as the first bit of the talk, I've convinced you language matters, that teachers are not well prepared to address language challenges, and actually language is pretty complex, and we need to understand and engage with that complexity to take things forward. Okay, so I hope in my little stairs, I've established what the important issues around pre-intervention are to some extent, okay? That there's a relationship around oral language, and there are things that we can do that. What about efficacy studies? What should we be thinking about here? So we move to the next step. So what I'm going to talk about here is something that I'm calling language nutrition. If you speak to people about nutrition in terms of food, people know about the components that you have to have, what would a balanced diet would work like, and language nutrition seems to resonate well with practitioners about what that balance might be. So the kinds of drivers of oral language that we're looking at is an environment which is sufficient language exposure to facilitate or to nourish a child's brain. This early language exposure needs to be rich in quantity and in quality so that children can use data to drive their development. And it's talking and interacting with or reading with a child in what I'm going to call is a serve and return engagement. So that's an interaction between adults and children, and also children and other children. So that's the kind of framework that we're looking at. So what actually happens in early years settings, you know, when you observe these different settings? So these are data that were collected with my colleague James Law, where we did some observations across reception, year 1 and year 2, using a tool that we developed called the Communication Supporting Classrooms tool. And basically the tool had 3 dimensions, one which was the language learning environment. So that's, you know, was there a quiet corner? Was there good soundproofing in the room? Were things labeled and so forth? Then there are these language learning opportunities. So if you don't have the context to learn the language, well, it's not going to really happen. So that included small group work, interactive book reading, including all children in the settings. And then there what I'm calling language learning interactions. So these are interactions that have been shown to be effective in supporting children's language. And that's in the ways in which teachers talk with children. And some of these can be really simple. So they can be actually using a child's name to engage them. That's, again, you'd think that that would happen all the time. That doesn't necessarily happen. And others were more complex, where teachers would talk through an activity, so scaffolding an activity for the children. Particularly good example that I was very impressed with was observing a year 2 writing class, and the teacher, he was teaching handwriting. Now, most handwriting classes I observed were very quiet, but this guy was different, and he spoke to his class, and he turned to one young lady, a little girl, and he said, "I'm going to come back to you, so you listen." And he talked through what he was doing. He said, first you put the pencil right on the line. So he used language to talk the children through the activities, and then the children did it. And this was a very dynamic writing class. So that's one scaffolding the children's thinking there. So what do we see? Well, in these settings, there's about 50 of them here that we observed. So language learning environments are generally pretty good. I tend to put error bars in my graphs because I think it's useful for us to think that an average is just an average and that there's a big range within this. So some of these settings, we're using all the best practices. I wouldn't necessarily expect that to happen because they vary, and some we're not. However, when you look at language learning opportunities, so these observations went over the first hour and a half of the morning in all these settings, which we piloted, shows the best time to capture the best practice. Actually, there wasn't an awful lot of it. So if you're thinking about where your language nutrition is going to happen and how it's going to develop, again, some were really good. There was some variation there. And in terms of language learning interactions, well, it's better, a lot of variation. But what we're finding here is that there were about 20 of them that could be ticked off in a session for up to a maximum of 5 times. What we were getting was the ones that were perhaps less conceptually demanding for children, that didn't extend children's language, so it would be labeling something or naming something. So there was scope to develop that. Okay, so what about oracy skills on entry to school? So we know from previous work, both American and British work using the Millennium Cohort, that in areas of social disadvantage, children are on average struggling with their oral language. On average, really important to say on average. Not everybody is. So there's variability, cluster of needs varies. Most of the studies that actually report this tend to not talk about, in England, we would talk about children of English as an additional language because that muddies the water, but actually that's what is in the classroom, so we do that. So what we did was, and this was pre-COVID, so none of this is an impact of COVID, was look at patterns of need in areas of deprivation. So we took the lowest quintile of deprivation. We have 800 children, both monolingual and children with English as an additional language. I'll explain how those children were identified later, to look at the diversity of need. Okay, so I'm going to look at the social disadvantage in a kind of a generic way by using an effect size difference from what you would typically expect. All right, so the data are simplified for this graph. So what about something like non-word repetition? Did that differ? Any significant differences? The answer is no. So in areas of social disadvantage, on average, across the group, there is no difference between what you would expect for children who are typically developing. So let's take the next step up. So a sentence repetition task, this is where children are asked to repeat short sentences, so they don't have to generate the sentence themselves. Okay, did we get an impact? Yes, we did. So we have a significant impact in terms of sentence repetition. But, look at my standard deviations. We've got variability here. What about naming vocabulary? So it's norm reference. Well, the effect becomes bigger. And when we look at something like verbal comprehension, well, it's significant. Okay, so again, what we're thinking about is if we're going to take these data back and think about how we embed them in interventions, we've got language is important. We've got teachers struggle with language. We know what the kind of settings need to do, but they're not always happening, and that we're seeing these areas where we would like to target. So large numbers of children with significant language learning needs, staff not well prepared to meet those needs, prior knowledge varying, and settings are variable, but typically not offering strong language learning environments. Okay, now the point about those data, while there are variability, you've got classes or nursery classes with 35 or before COVID, 35 children, where 80% of them were struggling with language. So how could you possibly go in to do a targeted intervention with the lowest 10%? In fact, that would be inequity. So we're talking about something that I'm going to call targeted universal intervention. So that's, we know there are areas that there are challenges. It is all children in those settings because you can't pick them out reliably and you can't predict the future, where you develop staff to support children's oral language. And this was some work we did some time ago where we developed a program called Talking Time. And basically Talking Time was scripted but flexible. So it allowed those teachers to work with the serve and return. It allowed them thinking about what their particular context might be. So it's really very different than if you're in the center of Tower Hamlets than if you're in Stanley in the Falkland Islands. But in both cases, kids struggle with language or oracy skills. And we implemented it twice a week for 15 minutes in this setting. And I'll talk a little bit about the end about why we did that and why it's not good enough. Small group activities provided to all children in the class and mixed ability. So that took a lot of work with the staff to do mixed ability. But actually the staff benefited because they had children in the group who could talk, and they could also talk with each other and scaffold it and be flexible around that. And we used a coordinated approach in a game-like format. We targeted vocabulary, comprehension. You can see these are things that have come up in this, that are difficult, and oral narrative skills. All right. So that was our first go at this. It wasn't an RCT, it was a quasi-experimental design, but it did show significant effects. And it did show, at that point, significant effects on children's comprehension skills. Right. Effectiveness study. Does it actually work? Well, so we implemented the intervention in a large trial in areas of social disadvantage. We actually started it pre-COVID, but then had to stop in the middle and then had to go back. So there's a COVID impact here, which is difficult to disentangle. Cluster randomized trial, 40 nursery settings from the lowest quintile of deprivation in London and the Northeast. We were underpowered because pre-COVID, lots of people signed up, and this is sort of like the schools just opening after COVID, and there were lots of difficulties with actually getting into schools and actually children being there. Settings were randomized into intervention or business as usual. And we had baseline and follow-up data to try and capture the effect of the intervention at 3 different levels. One is the child language, which is ultimately what you're hoping to support. The other was the practitioner-child interactions. If that didn't change, why would the child language have changed? So that was supposed to be our driver. And the third one I won't talk about, which is the parent care reported language use and behavior. And I can tell you why I'm not talking about it later if you want. So what did the program look like? So it was deliberate contrast to scripted interventions where staff were given a structured handout with prompts that they could use and develop as was appropriate in the setting. So they had continuous CPD through professionals across the intervention period, and they had access to them. And the aim was to, by the end of the intervention, which again, because of COVID, went 16 weeks, that the staff could create their own plans and adapt the program to the children that were going in, because there's no point in having something that's so narrow that you can only do it for one group of children at one particular time. We wanted to skill up the practitioners, empower them. The focus on adult learning as well as child learning to build capacity. So it's both cost effective, but it's also respectful for the teaching profession that you're not going in and you're coming in to tell them what to do, but working with them about what to do. And that allowed us, ultimately, we would hope the staff would be able to embed and generalize the program's principles in different areas of practice. this comes from the work that my colleague Sandra Mathers has done, is that 2 factors with strong evidence of impact on child outcomes. So that's pedagogical knowledge. Most effective teachers have a deep knowledge of the subjects they teach. We've shown that oral language is not part of most teachers' pedagogical content. And the quality of instruction, so they know what's effective questioning, open questions, scaffolding to introduce new information. So the original program that Morgan and I put together was already manualized, but was significantly developed by Sandra and her team working with us at Oxford. So there was a section on story conversations that provided staff with information about what they could do and how they could ask questions around it. And a worked example for one book was provided showing them what to do. And we also gave the schools, all the settings, these 5 different books. Okay, now 2 of them are wordless books, because actually it's much harder to use a wordless book with different groups of children, because it depends on your skills as a practitioner to talk with the children and to engage them. Sit there and you can read the words more straightforward. So again, that was something new in what we did here. Now, for comparison purposes, all the business as usual schools were given these books. Okay, so because we're going to look, we had some vocabulary items from these vocabulary items from here, but so that was all, everybody had access to that. Okay. So after all that work, did the children improve over time? Did it matter if they were multilingual or English as an additional language, or what we're going to call dual language learners? And was there an impact of our intervention at all? Did it change the language nutrition that the children received? Did it change over time, just generally? And was there an impact of the intervention? So I'm just going to raise this point about changing over time. You know, actually, if you've been in school, so our baseline testing was done in November and the next testing was done in June. If you've been in school for that length of time, you'd expect some changes, one would hope, on some of the issues that weren't norm referenced anyway. But also you might get changes for the staff as they become more familiar with the children and they adapt to the interactions with them. So change over time is just, you know, what one would predict would happen. Impact of the intervention, that's trickier. Okay. So what did the trial show about the children's language? Okay, so we had measures that I'm going to call control measures, which were from the British Abilities Scale and a non-word repetition task, because we had no reason to expect that this intervention would impact on non-word repetition. We had 3 standardized measures that we'd used before COVID, which one was a sentence repetition, a verbal comprehension, standardized verbal comprehension task, and a naming vocabulary test. And because we were panicking that we might get locked out again, we introduced the quick interactive language scale, which the teachers could have done on a computer, which covered vocabulary, syntax, and processing. And to the best of my ability, this is the first data, it's an American test that's been used here. So that was done on, you know, as I said, 600 children. And then we had a bespoke vocabulary items. So embedded in the training, but never explained to the staff who were in the intervention group, there were 4 target object words and 4 target actions, so verbs, activities. So we didn't say that we want you to teach these, they just were part of what was going on. There were also control object and action words that were not in the books at all. Okay, so the question is, did it make a difference in the intervention? So I'm going to start by looking at this question of, you know, so these are children in areas of significant social disadvantage. What about those that are dual language learners? Now, when I talk about dual language learners, these are not young people, yet children, little ones who've just arrived in the country. They are all children who've been in the country for a number of years, but some are speaking a different language at home most of the time, but it varies. It varies tremendously. It was extremely difficult to establish. Right. What about the impact of being a dual language learner? So these graphs are all going to be pretty much the same. If there's a red circle with a cross in it means it didn't have an impact. If there's a green tick in a green circle, it means it did have an impact, for ease of going through this. So did it matter if you're a dual language learner? Well, it didn't for our two nonverbal measures. It did for non-word repetition, but they were actually better than the typically developed, the monolingual children. And it did for virtually all the other language measures on standardized scores. The bespoke items, it didn't have an impact on the other. So on average, the dual language learners had poor language skills in a group that are already struggling. Okay, now this has an impact, I think, particularly in intervention, because if you're working with children who are only talking in utterances of 1 or 2 words, and I'm not joking about that, it's really difficult to embed and support the children. I think it's possible, and we try very hard to do that. And actually, I should say, some of you may be familiar with a measure called the bus story, which is an oral narrative task, which we used in the pre-data on the 800 children. But of the 800 children, only 112 scored or produced enough to score the bus story task at the age of 3. So it wasn't used in this study. We did use it in follow-up, but it's another story. Okay, so there's an impact of children who are dual language learners. Did they improve over time? Well, they did improve over time for some measures, for non-word repetition, matrices, sentence repetition, verbal comprehension, naming vocabulary, and the quills vocabulary, okay? So, I mean, those are all of them on standardized measures. So that was good, that there was some improvement over time. So being in the nursery setting, it benefited the children. But just to note that on our bespoke vocabulary measure, which were chosen all from a standardized, well, from a language test and object and action naming task, all of which children at the age of 3 or 3.5 should know. All of our, well, very few of our children, you know, generally are improving at all. They're not having that exposure. Well, did we have an intervention effect? Well, sort of. So as you can see, most of them are red crosses or red circles with a cross in them. There was a non-significant trend in favor of the intervention, but what we did get, and which is really interesting, is our impact on our target object and action words. So these are words that were just in the activities that teachers were working with the children and engaging with them. Remember, the staff did not know we were interested in those. So there are all sorts of reasons this might have happened. It could have been COVID. It could be that the intervention had to be truncated because times in the nurseries. It could be the fact that actually, and I really strongly believe this, that 2 sessions of 15 minutes a week for 14 weeks is not going to drive the difference in language that we would hope. But I would have hoped, so that's the children's language, I would have hoped that we would have an impact on the ways in which the teachers spoke with their the children. So what I'm calling is this language nutrition. And how we measured this was not by observations, but we recorded group conversations. Again, we weren't allowed into the schools to observe, which actually worked really well in this case. So there were recordings of group conversations that were led by Keely and Sandra. And they were measured along a number of different dimensions. So how long the interactions went, the conversations went on for, duration, number of utterances, the types of utterances, the conversations, proportion of child engagement utterances, the types of prompts that teachers used. So was there a change? It isn't growth. It should be change over time. Yes, in some of these, there was a change over time, not in the types of prompts that the staff used and not in the total number of conversations, but, you know, they got longer, there were more utterances and children engaged more. But that's just happening generally across all the settings. Did the intervention make a difference? Well, yes, it did. It made a significant difference in the length, the number of utterances, the amount of talk the children were giving in those settings, the more turns in those settings, that there were more extra textual prompts by the staff, and they were using more extra textual utterances to support them. So in terms of language nutrition, there is evidence, indicative evidence, that there was a change in what was being offered. So what does it mean for implications for intervention? Well, large numbers of children with significant language learning needs, staff aren't well prepared. We know that it differs between the settings, and the settings are variable, but typically not offering strong language. You have to get in early and keep doing it to get it right. Okay. So in terms of what we did, and I just want to go to make sure I thank my colleagues up here. This was obviously a team effort. It was not one person cycling around London. I think we made a good start in terms of what could be done. I think there are challenges about how we can take this forward, and I think we've learned an awful lot. So we now have a very large EEF trial that Sandra is leading from Oxford, that we hope we can use some of this learning to take things forward. So the issue for me in terms of implementation science is building up this bank of knowledge to take you to the right step. But building up that bank of knowledge necessarily, I would argue, means listening to the staff and looking at the context in which they come from, and also listening to the children. Because if I go back to my example of the bus story, which lots of people use, we would have lost the data, you know, for 3/4 of our sample. That's not listening to children, that's imposing something on children. So I have a couple of questions that I'll just throw open and we can turn to yours. So when we go forward with the next trial, we want to capture more from the teacher talk and the exchanges with the children. So those were very simplistic analysis. They're very descriptive. Can we look at how that develops over time? And be interested in comments and criticisms about how we interrogate the main data set. I mean, we have a lot of data there on children that needs to be explored more fully. And I think that is done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for the fascinating talk. Please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, and we can just make sure the sound is working here. And if you have any other questions, you can just put them in the chat. I just want to start with one question, if that's okay.
Of course.
Can you tell us more about the perspectives that the staff had about the activities or the exchanges that took place?
Okay, so that's part of the report about the Nuffields. And we had very positive engagement for the staff. They enjoyed these activities. I mean, part of that had to do with the skill of the team from Oxford, who've done a lot of CPD work. But it also, I think, had to do with the fact that their points of views were valued, that the mentors actually went in and worked with the staff, and they did practice activities together. So overall, and that was the analysis that was done by Liz Hewitt and Sandra, the process data is very positive. But, you know, you need more than just very positive process data.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions in the room before we take the question in the chat?
Go on. My understanding is that there's a phenomenon if you go for very early diagnosis of oral language delay, that some of that resolves.
Absolutely
there's a
right.
differentiation between what turns into developmental language disorder and what looks like more environmentally.
Well, yeah, I mean, really, you can't pick up specific something if you were going to call it DLD. You know, you weren't going to get that. You're not going to. Our measures aren't good enough. You know, and we can't predict. So, Bruce Tomlin talks about these early years as being like a spaghetti that, you know, kids go up and down depending on which way you turn the fork. This is slightly different. I mean, I'm not saying that these children have a language disorder, and I think that's important. I'm saying the kids' language skills are not strong enough, as not as strong as they should be to access the curriculum. And that has to do partly, I would say, with the types of exposures and opportunities that they've had to develop language. Now, whether some of them go on to have a specific language difficulty, I don't know. I left my crystal ball at home, sort of thing. But, you know, so I think this is what good pedagogy is. You know, you support all children, and then you do it by differentiating the curriculum, and not sufficient numbers of children in these settings need support. You know, if you can't create a 2-word description of the bus story, you're gonna have a bit of a hard time. And the staff knew exactly what to do to improve their phonics skills. You know, they could be right there sounding out things, but that wasn't where the issue was. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
One follow up, there's some work that looks at individual differences between teacher language, I think it's in the area of maths, and then children's vocabulary growth through the school year. Did you find variability in teacher language? Or are you going to look
So
at
we
that?
don't have we don't have sufficient, yeah, it wasn't part of the study, and we don't have sufficient information to say anything like that because we haven't collected those data. What we do have is those audio recordings where teacher language changed and children were able to talk more in those settings, you know, so, or they were talking more in the intervention group, you know, so yeah, more to be done there, I would say, as far as that's concerned.
Thank you. So we will take one question from the chat.
Okay.
So can you speak to correlations between the development of oracy and autonomous thinking?
So correlation between the
Yes.
development of oracy and autonomous thinking. Well, it's not a question I've actually thought about before, but I think there's sufficient evidence to say that discussing and talking through things helps support ideas. And it's one of the reasons I would always recommend my students before they do an essay to talk with other people about what they're thinking and planning. So yes, talking, if that's what is meant by autonomous thinking here, yeah, I think there is evidence that would support that.
Can I speak?
Yes.
I don't know. Am I on?
Yes.
Speaker?
Yes.
Hi, Sinead Crowe here from Ireland. I'm a regional recovery teacher, and I do find that an awful lot of oracy really has to be modelled by the class teacher and the regional recovery teacher in their support system. And I do believe that when you speak to children or you model reading a book like the Owl Babies I was doing this particular week, I've done Jared's a Giraffe, I've done a number of books. I mean, you all know the big books that are very, very engaging for children, and they really engage with the characters and they just love listening to the language, and you can get an awful lot from them by talking to them about the characters, getting them to think about the characters. And I also try to stop them saying happy and sad for every, happy eventuality in a story, or any, disappointing that, he's happy, she's sad. It's like, okay, well, we can actually develop, and how else could he be feeling? And I just feel as though we as teachers need to model language to them, speak to them on their own level, having them engage with a particular character or a particular theme story. And I do believe that that actually does enhance their language development, their oracy, and their confidence in being able to speak back, because they mirror things back to you to a degree, and you can actually see them wanting to engage back with you.
Sinead, maybe you actually looked at the manual, because there is a story talk part of that which involves talking with children around the stories, and some of it is modeling and expanding their language. So everything you would say, you've just said, I would say is important. And there's an evidence base, not our evidence base, but there's another literature that would support what you're doing. The problem we found is that not all teachers find this easy. And one of the reasons that the wordless books was introduced was that meant the teachers and the staff had to do more work about talking with the children. But yeah, absolutely agree.
Well, I have to honestly take my hat off to the reading recovery training I have gotten, because it does build one's confidence as a teacher. And I do try to use that particular training that I've gotten to build into my own staff in order for them to have these natural conversations with children. I think, and I've learned this, a genuine conversation with a child versus what a teacher wants to talk about. Maybe allow the child to have a conversation with you and then build upon that conversation can do an awful lot for their oracy and their language development. And I believe that that has, I've seen that anyway in my own school, and I'm not taking any, as I say, I've learned all these skills from my reading recovery training. And I have to, you know, hands up to my teacher leader and all the people that have been involved in my program. But I do believe that children are very, very malleable and easy to engage once they know people are interested, once they know a cohort in crime, i.e. an adult, an adult who's interested in them, they genuinely come to you and they do actually want to express their understandings and their feelings. And once they're respected, once those expressions are respected, they kind of feel a little bit more esteem in what they can say. And over a course of time, it's not necessary within the one lesson or two lessons, but after a couple of weeks, if you are having that rapport with those children, they do seem to bounce back with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, you're right. But you've had a lot of talk about that. I mean, for our trainee teachers, I gave the 1 hour lecture they'll get on oral language at the beginning of term, and they won't have anything else. So, you know, you've got that background to bring to that. But absolutely important. Thanks.
Okay, just want to share.
And we had Kay. We had someone raise their hand.
Hi, my name is Kay, and thank you so much for calling on me, and thank you for the validation of our speakers today and our attendees. My question about autonomy is one that I stay concerned about as children grow in their influence of those beyond their teachers. In the early grades, the adults that they are around that are modeling and creating a culture of oracy for them are limited. But now that they move on into upper elementary and middle school, the adults and or other influences can create such a resounding voice that their autonomy of thinking and then parroting back what they hear becomes stronger, strengthened through the digital media outlets. So this early piece that you're adding here is very important for children in a classroom to see the adults around them speaking to each other, and then, as Sinead said, speaking authentically to a learner in the room is powerful autonomy creating foundation. And so your study gives a lot of credence to that. And so I want to thank you for that. And then add a piece about an instrument called the Sierra classroom observation instrument. And it's used for watching literacy instruction, but there are a couple of ways that ping an overall score on that instrument up in the classroom. And that is when the conversation pattern ventures a little bit away from teacher, student sequence into teacher, student, teacher. And I've used that instrument a lot, specifically that one indicator, to look at the oracy culture that's created in the early grades. And so I want to look at that further with what you shared with us today. And so that rounds out my comment and my thoughts about autonomy, and any other thoughts that you have would be great.
Okay, well, it would be really, I don't know what the instrument you're talking about, so I'd really be grateful if you could send me an email and give me the details of that. I think it'd be helpful to have a look at it. Right. How do findings from the cognitive sciences about the effectiveness of direct teaching interact with findings on the importance of dialogic teaching for children's language development? Right, discuss, I think is what I have to do there. I think you, in my view, you might have a different view, that you have to think about what it is you are teaching. Right. So language is not about, learning a vocabulary specifically. You're learning a tool for communication, or you're acquiring, rather than learning, you're acquiring a tool for communication, and the environment sort of scaffolds that. Whether there are certain elements within that that require some elements of direct teaching. So I know in the States, for example, they have tier 1, tier 2 vocabulary that you have to get at particular levels. We don't have that here. I think that's possible, but the whole act of what you're using language for is communicate, understand, and express what's going on. It kind of works to as an infrastructure to take you through to the next stage. Now, I've got colleagues who think that certain aspects of this, for a variety of reasons, need to be trained. So somebody, for example, about conversation skills, who's doing some interventions around that. But I think when you talk about direct teaching and you think about dialogic teaching, I think it depends on the context and what you think you're doing, if you like. Say that. I would also make a point that these challenges that exist about language that we talk about, there's a big increase in children who have problems with language and so forth. If you look at the literature about 50 years ago, when in the UK we had grammar schools and secondary modern schools, one of the things that was picked up and identified in secondary modern skills was the poor oral language of the young people who were going there. So this is not new. I think it's a challenge that we need to think about. It may be more important in terms of the way we work and interact now, but it's not new.
Okay. Just one last question. Sorry.
Is it on there? No.
Yes,
All
we
right.
have
In
Manana asking, what do you think is the most critical or conceptual or methodological challenges you face in your research? That is the first question. And how could addressing these challenges result in a more comprehensive understanding of the relationship between language and learning?
I think probably for me is getting a reliable and valid measure of what we think children's oral language skills are, because it's certainly much more than a receptive vocabulary test. And we battle in just about any project that I've been involved with about how on earth we get this right. And that continues to be a problem. But for the EEF trial, there's a limited amount of money. What do they go in and measure? And if they go in and measure that, will it make a difference, or is it too simple? So that's a big problem. How could addressing these challenges result in more? Well, I think it would benefit. I think we went some way with the first study when I talked to you about looking at what oral language made up oral language skills, because to the best of my knowledge, I could be wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, that's the first study that's highlighted narrative as such a key skill at the entrance to school. So doing that, even though the measures are limited in some way, and we'll see how it impacts over time, actually could help in understanding what's going on between language and learning, because it moves beyond the notion of vocabulary and probably more into the ability to engage and exchange around learning.
Okay, thank you. We have one comment from Lisa. And just one last question, if you
Yeah, sure. No.
Was there a lot of discrepancy between what the parents reported regarding language use over the period of the intervention?
Okay, so I kind of skated over that one, didn't I, really? So we did have a questionnaire that was a shortened version of the language use questionnaire that we gave to parents at the beginning. And of course, with this sample in disadvantaged areas, we had a lot of parents who didn't have English as a first language. And we also had a lot of parents who, even though the test is supposed to be okay for people who've gone to, primary education, who probably had difficulties engaging with it. So that meant that in the first study, for of the 800 children, about 150 parents filled in this questionnaire. However, I would say that the data that we could then match what the children's language levels were like with what the parents were saying, and it was really good, very consistent, and I indeed might think again about trying to ask the parents more about language, and it was particularly good. But so that measure we asked in their home language and also in English. So sometimes people don't necessarily involve parents as much as they could, and if we'd had more, only a proportion of this, a lot of people didn't fill it in. What happened? But parents may be part of our answer about how we get this right about language, measuring language.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure if we have any other questions. If not, any other questions in the room? Okay, then this was the end of our talk today. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who attended as well. So the talk will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and you can also find previous CEN talks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.